kind of think that there are parts of design that you can't put metrics to. I've thought about this a great deal, and at one point in my life, I nearly applied for a PhD program in design and computation because I was really into this idea of like, how can you quantify what good design is? Right? It's been a long time kind of thinking through that. Ultimately, I think it does human experience a disservice when you try to measure everything, because finally, I don't think you can account for a person's experience of a place. And this is the realm of poetry. This is the realm of memory. This is the realm of imagination. So I do think ultimately there are things that you can draw, you can render, you can create a sense of an atmosphere, and you can put amazing words to it. Can you measure it? No. And that's really okay.
What if the fastest way to fight carbon isn't new buildings at all, but rethinking the ones we already have? That's the big idea in today's episode with Francis Cooke, design principal at AECOM. Francis has led design at SOM, Perkins & Will, and Paycop Fried, among many other great firms. And he brings a decade of experience as a carbon reduction devotee and a design culture builder. In this conversation, you'll hear how to make the biggest carbon dent with facades and mechanical systems, why embodied carbon matters now, and how to frame it so developers listen, and the surprising truth about when perfect metrics still produce the wrong building. If you want to cut carbon, cut cost, and still design with a soul, this episode will give you a blueprint worth using. Let's dive in. Hey everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of Buildings 2.0. Today I'm with a very special guest, Francis Cooke, design principal at AECOM. Francis, thanks for joining.
Hey, thanks for having me. Glad you guys reached out. Happy to be here.
So, Francis, you've been at the helm of some incredibly exciting design firms, currently at AECOM, but have led design over at SOM, Pickard Chilton, Perkins Will, Paycop Fried, you name it. And you're a self-described carbon reduction devotee, integrated delivery evangelist, and design culture builder. There's a lot to unpack there. But before we get into that juicy stuff, tell me, how did you fall in love with buildings? Take us all the way back.
Honestly, it probably had to do with this coffee table book my mom had on Art Deco architecture. And I would just, as a kid, kind of like, oogle over that. And like a lot of kids, Lincoln Logs and Legos, like had all that stuff. But when I was really young, Star Wars was kind of a thing. And what I started to do is take like leftover toilet paper rolls and shoe boxes and Avon boxes that my mom was selling Avon. And I would make my own Star Wars sets. So I like had the figures, but I was kind of like, roughly with cardboard and scissors and tape, just kind of making all of the bits and pieces. And that's just what I did to entertain myself. But it was in sixth grade, I was going through the elementary school library and I found that great book by David Macaulay called Cathedral. I don't know if you know, but he did a series of like children's books about architecture. He's like a RISD trained architect. The pen and ink work is amazing. But it was like the unfolding of the story about how a building comes to be. And the Cathedral book, goes through like 150 years and 3 people, their recollections of why they decided to build this and how they did. I remember I got to cross-section through the cathedral and I just like lit up like, oh my God, I understand this. Like I get this. And I was like, Mom, this, I want to do this. And she's like, architecture. I'm like, that's the word. I didn't know the word, but it's pretty much been an unrelenting drive since then, basically.
That cross-section of a cathedral was
yeah, it's like, I understand how by moving the load path out this way that the window could get skinnier and taller and let in more light, So, wow, like why the hell would I know that? But it kind of clicked.
Well, from cathedral to academia, you ultimately realize, okay, maybe architecture is your thing. Talk to me a little bit about your education. Did you grow up in the parametric era and the blob era and the postmodern? Like what?
Okay.
Take us back.
I got my undergraduate degree in 1996 from Oklahoma State, and they were fiercely proud of having kind of an unchanged pedagogy that they very effectively borrowed from the University of Illinois back in the mid-70s, late 70s. So like we started off with like a version of Haydock's 9-square problem, right? And we had one class in the engineering department of AutoCAD Release 9, where it was like 3 people to a computer. And I was like, what the fuck? No one's ever going to use this. This is pointless, whatever. I need to get back to the drawing boards. Undergraduate was absolutely all about drawing, making models, trying to be very clear about what you want to do. Because if you wanted to change the design last minute, there's no way you would have time to like literally erase everything and then redraw everything. So there's a certain throughput and very deliberate series of decisions like you wanted to stick to. When I started to work, that's when the digital tools started to come about. And I was working between undergraduate and graduate school when Columbia started using Max and Maya for the first time, and blobitecture kind of became a thing. I wasn't partially seduced by that, but I very intentionally chose to go to Penn for my graduate degree because ultimately I was more into human experience and user experience and phenomenology, and that narrow little piece of the program, the post-professional design theory thing run by David Leatherbar. I'm like, that's the thing that I wanted to do.
Mm.
Interestingly enough, I was surrounded by, Ali Rahim and other folks who were doing, a lot of digital work. And I was really still fascinated by that. And through time, I was like started learning Grasshopper back before David Rutten was hired by McNeil, back when it was this weird plugin for Rhino called Explicit History. So like I got into that like way early because it does follow a certain logic and patterning to it that makes sense. But I've never really lost my touch for like the analog as well. And for me, the key has always been trying to understand precisely kind of what I'm missing or what kind of information I need, and then just kind of toggling to whichever tool makes sense.
Yeah, you're one of those kind of rare breeds whereby you straddled across, I guess, what sounds like a mostly like input based approach. Kind of in the parametricism, as well as just kind of like the starting from the thing itself and working backwards with kind of the model making, and to your point, being very intentional about a certain few ideas and sticking with them. You don't see a lot of that. You're starting to see a lot more just kind of the latter.
Well, we had this conversation when I was a studio head at SOM, and the company was pushing more into like optimization was the thing that we were chasing. And we had this amazing group of guys that we hired from Stevens Institute that, were linking evolutionary search algorithms to energy software to Rhino and figuring out a way to kind of optimize, if you can define a problem a certain way for a site, let the optimization software run. And then, here's this building form for a tower in China at the time that, achieves all of those things, I do have kind of a soft spot for like, is there a way that you can arrive at architecture through a series of procedures and checks? Can you basically set an architectural problem in an evolutionary environment, and through these evolutionary positive and negative pressures, effectively kind of grow a building into them? So this is the thing that we've made. And we really started to research that. But some of the outputs that we were getting were things that like, okay, we didn't have enough data inputs to kind of drive actually how something is built or how something is shaped, or these other things that give rise to the project. And I was sitting with my colleagues and I was like, what happens if we nail that? We get all of this stuff done, hit enter, and we come back 15 minutes later and you just look at the metrics of the thing and it blows everything else off the chart. Smallest carbon, tightest floor plate, but the thing looks exactly like a giant squirrel. You're not going to go build a giant squirrel. I can't sell a giant squirrel. This particular developer really doesn't care about squirrels. So there's that other layer of understanding the level of expectation and what will resonate with an owner, but also a community and a society that has to be overlaid into that. And I finally think that's not something that you can measure. I think there's certain types of like human tacit intelligence and wisdom that it's got to come out of the wetware.
Mm-hmm. Talk to me a little bit about what it means to be a carbon reduction devotee. So one thing is kind of the mechanics of design, but why does reducing carbon matter? Talk to me as if I was a casual real estate developer who has heard about it, has heard, of course, the term sustainability, but like why should I really care about it?
Well, most of the time said developer would have been exposed to that would have been through this idea of like energy reduction, energy consumption reduction, right? So that's like active carbon injection, right? So over the course of the building's life cycle, you run, the HVAC systems, in this schedule and the lights on that schedule and whatever else. And that by virtue of providing that kind of human comfort, you basically consume and expend so much carbon. And we've been working at those kind of efficiencies for a while, really like since LEED started, right? Where it became a measurable thing. The clients ultimately got some benefit and cachet for. And like in the office building world, if you're doing a spec office building, you've got A and B, and you have prospective tenants coming in. A looks great, B looks great, but B happens to be LEED Gold. Then the theory was that would attract more tenancy and keep it more full, and they could charge slightly higher prices. This is getting back to like the business problems around the drive architecture. So operational carbon, right, as we'll call it, that's something that we've been working at for a while. The other piece of it that is starting to become more understood, and in the time frame that we have to work in is actually more important, is what's called embodied carbon. So that's like all of the carbon from the extraction of the material, its mining, its manufacture, and its transportation and being brought to site, and then how long it's going to be on the site, right? So embodied carbon actually is more of a key factor in today's market, because if you look at the time frame that we have to work with in terms of trying to make a dent in how much carbon we're putting into the atmosphere, we need to make that happen in the next 30 years. So the kind of efficiencies that you get from looking at operational carbon, the payoff of that over that 30-year period is nowhere near like what it's sitting on, which is like that first burp of embodied carbon that's baked into the cake like forever. And perversely, the more efficient you make your building, so the least amount of energy it uses, it actually makes the amount of embodied carbon as part of the building more of an issue.
Yeah. I've got a question for you, a bit of a scenario, something that I've never fully came to terms with. Tell me what I might be missing here, but I read somewhere that there's an estimated amount of buildings ranging about 1.6 billion buildings in the world ish. I'm sure that number fluctuates depending on how you classify some of that. But let's just assume that's true. And that let's assume that we also stop building buildings for the next 30 years, which obviously is not true. I asked myself, well, okay, what needs to be true in order for us to do something about the carbon existing within the building? Forget new ones, just what is already existing. And how do we do anything about that within 25, 30 years? Back of the napkin math suggests that, 1.6 billion divided by 25, 30 years, we're looking at hundreds of thousands of buildings a day from today to 25 days. That like something has got to give. Even if you said, well, and maybe only 10%, right? We're still talking about dozens of thousands of buildings every single day that we have to do something about. How do we even begin to wrap our arms around solving this at the speed that we're suggesting we need to, do something about it?
Well, the thing is, you don't have to operate on everything all at once. It's really needs that will change things. It's also really important to keep in mind that certain suites of the whole building have different life cycles. Like the structural system in a building, if it's done right, the base bones of the thing should have a life cycle of like 1 to 300 years, right? Mechanical systems, and interestingly enough, the exterior walls on most buildings tend to be on like a 30 to say 50-year life cycle. And then the interiors tend to have a lot higher of a metabolism, and they turn over every like 5 or 10 years. So really the opportunity is you look at the age of the building, you look at when it was built, you look at kind of wherever a building is right now. We work with developers to look at a lot of their portfolios of buildings, right? The real opportunity happens is anytime you have like a new interiors project, right? That might be a way to make more of a faster, broader dent, because the interiors get turned over relatively quickly. But here in the city, like in New York, like there's a lot of buildings that were built post-World War II. They were like the first generation curtain wall buildings. Like the exterior walls on those things are kind of reaching the end of their life cycle in tons of places. And that's the opportunity when you step in, like, okay, well, the system is failing now. It's leaking. Turns out, it was all single, monolithic glass. So your energy bills are kind of crazy. This is an opportunity for us to go in and say, okay, it's more than just about kind of beautifying and fixing the leaks. We can actually make it a lot tighter of a building. The building codes nowadays are a lot more, thankfully, kind of aggressive around energy. So if you look at ASHRAE 90.1, it gets tighter and tighter, but like the window to wall ratios are kind of getting smaller. So you have to think critically about exactly where you want to put the windows. Not every client can afford like the other path where you're trying to energy model everything. And that's one of those conditions that gives rise to a building that makes it interesting. And then as those codes start to change, the character of architecture necessarily would need to respond. So if you saw like an all glass building, nowadays it's brand new, they either took the energy modeling prescriptive path, or everything that you see there is glass. It's not actually glass. They look like glass on the outside, but it's like a shadow box and it has like serious insulation behind it. it's about understanding how those suites work, but then also human need is the thing that drives it. I mean, if you've got an old building that's kind of functioning, I mean, if it's not at the end of one of those life cycles, you kind of let it be, right? But if you're at the end of the exterior wall life cycle of mechanical systems, if those two happen to coincide at the same time, you can make a really big dent in a hurry. But even if it's like one or the other, updating the mechanical systems, you can make a pretty good dent in the energy. But if it's BABA based, you're not able to get the same kind of DOAS split system that you can get from Asia that actually is pretty energy efficient. So that also changes what's available.
I'm curious, if you had to, if the goal is ultimately minimize to reduce existing carbon within the existing footprint, the kind of the 2, 3, 4 levers that you would pull are ultimate. Like if you can wave a wand right now and just completely replace most existing buildings, what does it boil down to? Is it really just mechanical systems, facades?
Yeah, mechanical systems and facades are where I think you can make the most dent in a hurry. Now, if there's nothing wrong with the base building or programmatically, you can work around it. For God's sakes, keep it. Don't piss that away because that tends to be the more energy intensive stuff anyway. Yeah. Also, what are you building that facade out of, right? What recycled material content, low carbon content. So as you're replacing the facade, probably is not going to be in kind, right? Because you kind of don't build things the same way. And that's where the issue of like things looking historical and historical in like a contemporary modern sense, it's where it becomes a little bit difficult. When I was at Paycop Freed, I wasn't working on the project, but we were doing a reclad of a building over off Fifth Avenue. And the intention was to make it look as much as it did before, like the 1960s kind of building. And they are absolutely, Paycop Freed is one of the best like facade people you can possibly imagine. They're very thoughtful, careful, incredibly technically savvy. They were able to pull it off to kind of keep the same character of the building that was there before. And it was really a client motivation. There's a couple of tweaks if you know what you're looking at. But I see this as an opportunity for the character of the building to change, right? To be really an expression of the time. So you're not trying to mimic, a mid 1960s energy is too cheap to meter. We need all of this glass. We need all of this light. Not really according to the way that the daylight simulation works. But then it raises this question: if a building is, half or more of a solid wall and it's a big box building, we don't have too many models for that, right? The big boxes tend to be a big glass box. So that becomes an opportunity to really think through what is that thing as an icon, as an object? How does it communicate itself to the public if it's no longer a giant glass box? And this is where we're a little bit fumbling in the industry now, because you see people reverting to, pre-war models that were more solid buildings with some subtle tweaks. It's like, SOM and KPF and those guys are doing contemporary buildings that have a lot of GFRC, panels on them that look like arcades and arches and stuff like that. Curiously, it's not classical. And this is where I'm scratching my head going, okay, there's something emerging here. We're using historic forms, but no one's saying postmodern anymore, right? That piece of the argument's been jettisoned, but we're returning to forms that one could say make people feel more comfortable. So I need to probably get off my keister and do some research into who's writing about architectural theory right now to see if anyone's addressing this kind of phenomenon.
And I guess on that point, when we first met, you talked about cultural factors, which is a loaded term. If you kind of double clicked into that, there's the kind of the spirit of the times, I guess, as you're suggesting. There's kind of both regulatory and some the recent carbon emission reporting is one aspect of that, but also political. How do you when you talk about cultural factors, which ones you're standing kind of in the middle of a bunch of these different factors? How do you grapple with them, and how do you take inventory as to just what to consider when ultimately making a proposal?
Well, you have to consider everything.
Everything, everywhere, all at once. Yeah.
Well, but I did my first little stint in graduate school was actually right out of undergrad at the University of Oregon.
Yeah.
And I was getting on the track to get a master's degree there in what was called ecological design. This was like before sustainability was even a word, before LEED. And I went in there thinking like, oh, we just got dumb because we have access to all this energy. Like there is a way to build buildings that respond to the climate, to use as many passive strategies as possible. I want to really start to explore how to evolve the typologies that we have now into something that's less energy intensive, right? And there's one way to do that. And I'll find it, just 23. the gall this kid has. But I was one of the books of the professor that I had for a reading course, G.Z. Brown, who's actually head of the department, had me read, and we were discussing was House Form and Culture by Amos Rappaport. And he makes this really interesting point that on the islands of Japan, the northernmost island of Hokkaido initially was settled by a very different racial group called the Jomon people. They were like from Korea, further up in Asia, and they had these pit dwellings and a really steep roof and all of that. And it was like perfectly adapted to the environment. The people that we think of as the Japanese folks who were actually started back then came from the Pacific Islands. And so they brought that type of building construction with them. So they had, lower slope roofs and verandas, and it was built up off the ground. Well, when the Yayoi people get up to the Northern Islands, they don't start building like this other culture. They build the way that they've always built, even though it's exactly wrong for the environment, right? In a cold environment, you don't want to have the underside exposed. You don't want the breezes underneath. You don't want to use so much more wood because you're insisting that this is the pitch of the roof and not that. So they just use more wood. They brought it a little bit closer down, but they didn't change the essential layout functions and forms of the buildings. And that was the thing that kind of like, I have to leave this program because there are other things that drive beyond comfort or beyond like a logical argument about why you would want to build in a different way. And that's the thing that sent me like on a very long reading quest and ultimately to Leatherborough's program at Penn. Because for me, I realized like the cultural motivations, like architecture is downstream from a cultural zeitgeist all the time. And that may or may not have energy consciousness as part of it, but oftentimes it doesn't. So I think it's culture, personality, first, and then you figure out a way to do the right thing in the midst of it.
You've got me now spinning my wheels in terms of, how do you even begin to grapple? I mean, again, to consider these different cultural forces.
Well, I'll give you an example. I'm going to do some editing here. I had a project recently in let's call it a red county. And they wanted to have a building of a certain kind of footprint size in there. And if we built it here, took the public space that was between the edge of the street and the face of the building. And if they wanted it low and long, cut that public space down to like 15 feet. And I figured out a way to do the programming of the building where you could do it because this building needed to work in large chunks. Rather than doing it like long and skinny, we kind of looked at, okay, well, if we kind of just put half of it on top of itself and make it taller, that creates more public space. And that's something that they want. But I was also thinking, what are the energy impacts of that? And funnily enough, the long, low one, and I did a basic kind of energy model of that thing. If you do it longer and low, it had more surface area. If you kind of stacked it, it got the overall building form closer to a cube. And therefore, it had like less perimeter surface to how much area it was enclosing. And so then I ran the predicted energy use intensity for both. And then I was like, okay, these aren't the kind of people that I need to have a discussion about saving energy with because it's just not the thing that drives them. But then I thought, two things. One of them, CapEx, capital expenditure first cost. So I'm solving your problem with less exterior wall area. That's cheap for you day one. But then also this entity is going to operate that building for the next 80, 100, 120 years. So I ran how much it would cost them to operate the buildings comparatively. And the one that was more compact, if it was finished this year, it would save them $45,000 in energy costs alone. And you can, for sure that cost is only going to go up. So rather than settling your county with more debt to pay for operating this building, let's do it. And they were like, that sounds good. They're lovely people. I managed to bamboozle them into doing something that's very energy responsible without ever saying sustainability, without, bringing any of that up. Because even though some of my direct people that I was working with, they were sensitive to that kind of thing, but like selling it up the food chain, I didn't want to give them a sales pitch that would fall flat.
Yeah. Yeah. It's striking how, it really is about framing. I mean, you'd be hard pressed. You'd think that at this point, we're talking about sustainability is a bit of a duh. Like, of course it matters, right? But I think it's really the framing, as you pointed out, like what ultimately what matters. Yeah, I'm taking notes here. This is just a general observation that I have. I started as an architect myself, moved to the other side of the table as a construction manager, and now I'm running a company. And I think one of the things that I've learned is that, in running technology companies, in terms of the framing of the product itself, I think technology tends to do it a little bit better than the traditional kind of AEC, specifically AE space, where with the AE space, you've got services that, depending on what firm you might be, there might be a certain brand or vibe or things like that. But at the end of the day, you're providing kind of design services whereby you're trusting, the judgment of the firm team you're hiring. But the output is a bit open ended. Whereas with tech, you're delivering a product, and so you're kind of often leading with the outcome, right? It's like, this is the thing, and then we're going to work backwards from getting that thing. I appreciate how you highlighted, though, because I mean, yes, when talking to a landlord, in this particular case, or developer, starting with the end is like, yes, ultimately, because you are, you're being mindful of the budget. Ultimately, you're funding this. We have to start with that and kind of work back, and ultimately trusting that you're doing the right thing and kind of the means by which you achieve, I think, their goals. But it's just a general observation. I mean, in terms of the business of architecture itself, in your experience, do you have any thoughts on that? Like, what is a good business of architecture versus perhaps a lesser? I mean, you've had a chance to see multiple firms. What are some of the better ones doing right about the business?
Ooh, where do you want me to start there?
We got time. Don't worry.
Well, curious because businesses are structured differently. This is my working where I do now. It's my first go around in a publicly traded company. And so that framework of a business approach is very different than being a private LLC. And there's variation within that. I don't think either one is necessarily better than the other, but the motivations and opportunities change. Right. So I think an LLC, so a business that's emerged, it's still owned by ownership within, and that could be either through a partnership agreement or employee owned kind of a thing. In that kind of a setting, I think there's often more of an understanding of the exigencies of practice, how markets will kind of fluctuate. So someone sitting somewhere saying you need to grow by this much this year, that doesn't happen because there's more of an understanding of how things work. What I've started to see, how we've responded, and myself and my other colleagues that I have here, is that in some ways, because we have this other kind of outside pressure on us for growth and development, it's forced us to be creative and innovative and integrated and find, cutting really clearly to get to a path to do the work that we want to do in a way that I think in a privately owned firm, you probably might not get to because you just don't have those kind of pressures. So it's not golden. It's difficult often, but what we have been able to do within this practice has been kind of remarkable. And the other great benefit is that I developed a taste for this at SOM, where like I had my engineers, MEP guys, and structure guys, everyone together. So if I wanted to go talk through a wacky idea, I could just go over and talk to Luke Leong or Bill or somebody, right? And we could like hash things out. And they were excellent in their fields. Where I am now, I've got access to more engineers and civil engineers and construction managers and people who do finance and look at tax grants. And like in a situation like this, I'm like at home because I can really start to think through the bigger levels of the picture so that we go and talk to a client. We can do cost estimating super early that's got some real teeth to it that so they don't run into problems further on down the field, right? You start to remove those potential places where someone might say, no, I'm not really sure about that. If you can show up early with an answer to that, you gain confidence in them and you can bring them on into the story and you can really get there.
Is that what you mean when you say integrated delivery evangelist? Like,
yeah.
I mean, folks around the table.
Is ideally, I would love to have, maybe a consortium, an offering that we bring where like we bring Tishman and Hunt or somebody to the table with the developer, like we got you all the way through. We're going to do early cost estimating. We're going to do early vetting of systems, early pricing. We're going to talk to the subs so that when we're drawing the details of this wall system, or if you have a particular linoleum floor that you like or whatever, we know we can embed all of that intelligence in the model from the beginning so that the process, doesn't go off in these long tangents, but really kind of is clean and streamlined because we have a lot of the answers ahead of time. And then we can focus our time on really trying to solve the spatial, architectural, social problems because we know exactly what cost per square foot we're working towards. We've got a surety that we can get there. We've got systems set up to do it. We know that they're biddable. We know that they're cost effective. We know you're not going to run any problems with sourcing, whatever it is. Like all of those questions are kind of pre-baked in and allows you to kind of focus on, let's talk about the cultural problem that you're trying to handle. Let's talk about how we're going to reach out to the community to get these kind of assurances ahead of time, make sure that they're on board. But the other kind of bigger picture, more intangible things that make a project a lot more successful in the end.
Yeah. I think what you're saying here recalls something I read that you wrote about the 4 design drivers for mid-sized buildings. And I think one of the points was about this idea of like simplifying complexity, talking about how folks, both clients or students, often just have too much data to grapple with.
They get paralyzed by it.
Right. Well, right. So, I mean, I think there's this kind of underlying thread that I appreciate in your perspective and your approach is about kind of embracing both complexity, but then ultimately kind of boiling down to simplicity. I mean, you just outlined, for example, an integrated design process that actually adds more complexity by adding more folks to the table. But hopefully, the irony there being kind of making a simple, more streamlined process for the end, for the client being. Tell me a little bit more about that. Like, what in terms of the role of data in your day-to-day. You talked about cost estimation. I assume there's also obviously design moves that represent data points. What's the role of data in your day-to-day right now?
I kind of think that there are parts of design that you can't put metrics to. I've thought about this a great deal, and at one point in my life, I nearly applied for a PhD program in design and computation because I was really into this idea of like, how can you quantify what good design is? Right? It's been a long time kind of thinking through that. Ultimately, I think it does human experience a disservice when you try to measure everything, because finally, I don't think you can account for a person's experience of a place. And this is the realm of poetry. This is the realm of memory. This is the realm of imagination. So I do think ultimately there are things that you can draw, you can render, you can create a sense of an atmosphere, and you can put amazing words to it. But can you measure it? No. And that's really okay. I do think that there's a fault and a false hope and false sense of security in trying to measure everything. Right? There's certain things of the building that must be measured, that must be taken care of, that must be ordered, that must be structured, that must, but there's also these other things about it that give it its humanity. And that's finally the piece where I'm kind of okay, moving forward in like the cloud of unknowing, right? Until we, finally arrive at the thing, you have a hunch and you're trying to follow it. And you're collaboratively developing this story along with the client and with your colleagues and everyone about what this thing is going to be. And I think to try to apply some kind of metric system to that, it would dim it.
It wouldn't be a tech podcast if I didn't ask you about AI. So obviously loaded subject, many different activities from pre-design to design, construction. But today, how has it made its way into your workflow? I'm just curious.
Like everyone else, we've been looking at AI and things now. We've been exploring a number of tools that kind of help us on the production end, on the QA QC, checking of work and being able to do and collect bits of research, and all of that makes a ton of sense. One slight worry that I have, and this actually was like not even AI, but is this building we were working on. One of my juniors was responsible for doing the stairs, right? So we were like looking through the plans, and I looked at it and I was like, whoa. Like there's a clearance here you're missing, and why would the rail go out that far when it can be tighter in because of this, and that? And they literally looked at me and said, that's the way the stair tool made it.
Not a good answer.
And we're like, okay, hold on. No, here's why not. The tool won't do everything for you. And the reason that myself and my other colleagues of a certain age know that is because we had to draw all of this stuff, in 2D and plans and sections and all of this stuff together. So we have that kind of tacit knowledge. And one of the things that I'm really trying to keep an eye on is I don't want to adopt any technology that would take away the critical learning experiences that got me where I am, because I can't make my replacements if they don't have the mileage in the right ways. So
it's such a critical problem. Yeah. It's how do you replace, if at all, the kind of wisdom that's just come through the sheer iteration that you've done? It's something that I don't know. I mean, I certainly worry about. I'm sure like everybody else. Yeah, I guess when, to your point, the tooling does the thinking for you and you kind of don't see the context or the train of thought behind it. When you let that play out long enough, eventually folks are just not going to be able to contextualize why they're making certain decisions. It's more of an open question. It's like, wow, what is What does that mean for the industry, for the
I
project?
think the utility of the tool will, or we'll find a spot of balance where we won't let that happen because we can't, right?
You
You
literally can't afford to, yeah.
right.
There's real consequence, yeah.
So it becomes a teachable moment where you sit down and like, okay, look, the stair can't do that because of this, that, and the other. And that's not the way they make a precast riser. Here's how it works, right? It becomes a kind of a teaching moment. So it might change the nature of the work where if the drawing and basement iterations can happen lightning fast, you might end up spending more time talking about the outcome and then using that as the moment to kind of help them develop wisdom. So they're not really gaining it the hard way, but it has to be passed down because otherwise it can't all be sitting in a database somewhere. So to answer another part of your question, oftentimes, like even in the beginning of the project, we'll start using AI prompts and maybe put in some model data and maybe not, and use it to just kind of see what it spits out and is like a initial talking point. I've oftentimes thought of AI as like in that piece of the ideation process, it's almost like having a very intense, very much on the spectrum intern, right? You kind of describe something like go, and then they go and just make a whole bunch of stuff. And some of, 90% of it's like, no, not gonna, whatever, but occasionally something will show up that, hold on, something here. We can work with this. This isn't it, but it's pointing in a direction. I don't think that's even necessarily unique to AI, right? I mean, you look at like Brian Eno had this great deck of cards that he used to make music called Oblique Strategies, and like these little cue cards that when he'd be stuck, he'd pull one out of the deck and look at and try to answer the weird prompt in it to reset his thinking about the proposition. Or you look like William S. Burroughs talked about in his writings where he would like do the cut up method where he would literally take a whole bunch of stories and newscasts and newspaper things and like clip them together and just randomly reassemble them. Burroughs' contention is that it shows you what you know but don't know that you know because it comes out of a collage montage type process. So in many ways, I see this particular way of using AI early on very much kind of in that vein where it's like, yeah, you can roll the dice, but sometimes you roll a 20 and that means something. Roll a 20 for all you D&D nerds out there.
I like to ask, amidst the change, obviously AI being a massive chapter, I guess, in this, I guess, era. You've been through parametricism and obviously the importance and evolution of that. You've described even some of the recent kind of return to, I guess, what folks don't want to call postmodernism. But I'm always curious to reflect on as things have changed from the times of you staring at that cathedral book to today. Lots have changed, but what would you say in 10, 20 years will probably not change about the way that we design buildings? There's a lot of change happening, but I guess that's a harder one.
We're still going to be drawing. At the end of the day, it comes out of something inside of you, right, that you chase. I think people have an intuition. I think the active imagination is something that won't go away. That's the genesis about which all these ideas kind of take formation. It could be any number of and creating a narrative structure and finding the right story for the project. So I remember when I got into grad school at Penn, I was working at HOK Sport in Kansas City. The project architect I was working with on a project started grousing at me like, man, why do you got to go to grad school? You don't learn that stuff. School, you have school. You got a degree. You learn it by working. This is where it is. This is where it happens. So why do you want to go off and do other things? I'm like, okay, Aaron, funny you should say that. So, and to be fair, it was a little bit not fair to him because he wasn't the design principal. But I said, okay, we have and he's like, the building emerges, you got a client, you got a site, you got a budget, and then it happens. What do you need to talk about? I'm like, okay, Aaron, the way that you described it, there must be 80 ways that those three factors can come together. Why is this one that we're doing right now the right one and the other 79 well, that's why I'm going to graduate school, Aaron, because you can't answer that for me. I need to know why.
Funny if Aaron's listening in, but you did push Francis into an incredible route that I think has materialized into a great career. So Francis, this has been really fun.
Hey, appreciate it.
For those that want to follow along with your journey, your career, how do they stay in touch with you?
LinkedIn is probably the easiest way to stay in touch. The AECOM website is impossibly labyrinthine, but we're working on streamlining it someday.
Well, Francis, has been super fun. Can't wait for part two. I think this has been incredible primer on everything from carbon to business models to the markets to academia. So I can't wait for the next session. But thanks so much.
Appreciate it. Have a great day.